Thank you, Steve, for that introduction, and thanks everybody for coming out to this book talk. I'm very new at doing book talks since this book has only been out about 12 days, and this is, I think, the 8th place I've been talking about my book and the process in which I went through to write the book. I spent about 8 years working on it, and it was rejected. My manuscript was rejected by 33 publishers, so I was ready to say it was not very good, just the hell with it. And then a publisher finally came through and actually did a pretty good job of developing my story the way I wanted it developed, and has a complete index and many endnotes and lots of photographs. It's basically a story of my entire journey from a small town boy in upstate New York in the 50s, a typical commie-hating, baseball-loving patriot who was an all-conference athlete in my high school, and sports was everything, and so I thought everything was just wonderful. It was kind of wonderful, actually, in my little world. And then I started experiencing realities when I left home, and yeah, as you know, realities are very different from what we were told when we were little kids growing up. So I'm going to select a couple readings. I'm still trying to figure out which readings to read to which audiences. There's so much stuff in here. I actually still trying to figure out those passages to read at book readings, because again, I'm new at this, so I'm learning the process by which to present little tidbits to the audiences. Quite frankly, I never really thought this was going to happen. So when I saw the UPS truck drive up to our house in Portland, I ordered one box of books, actually 3 boxes of books from the printer in advance, just so I had some before they got to the publisher in Oakland. And when the UPS truck drove up, I could see that he was unloading these boxes of books. And I said to Becky, my wife, I said, "Hey, the books are here, the books are here." And she went and got a camera and took a picture of me opening the box and taking out a book and having it in my hand. It was like, whoa, 8 years, I can hardly believe that this is really happening. So I think I will start off by reading a little section from my Vietnam experience, which is where really I had my epiphany that really jolted me in ways that I could not have imagined. There were experiences before I was in Vietnam, especially when I was living at the D.C. jail for 10.5 months in Washington, D.C. I was there as a law student, living with the prisoners, eating with the prisoners, and actually studying the whole criminal justice system from the perspective of the prisoners in the D.C. jail. There were 1,400 prisoners there in a prison designed for 700. And as a law student, but pre-Vietnam, I was still extremely ignorant and naive. And so that had kind of prepared me for some openings that exploded later. Especially when I got to Vietnam. Now, when I was drafted in 1966, I joined the Air Force instead of going in the Army, and I was an Air Force first lieutenant when I was sent to Vietnam as a Ranger officer in charge of 43 men, and I didn't know the Air Force had Rangers. I didn't volunteer for that either, but that's where I was. So one of my extra duties in Vietnam became assessing the success or failure of bombing strikes on targets. And it was just an extra duty because my primary task with all my men was to protect the the fighter bombers on the base from attacks. We were attacked while I was there about 14 times, and so your adrenaline is working all the time to survive. So this is about the first day I went out on an extra duty. The extra duty was to assess success of bombing missions because we were told that the pilots, these were South Vietnamese pilots in this case, were infiltrated by the enemy who were going to sabotage the bombing missions. And they wanted to make sure there was a sober American officer, because I was not drinking in Vietnam, and I was very anxious because I was over my head in my duties, and I read a lot of reports, thinking that if I read all the intelligence reports, I would be very well prepared for my job, which probably didn't have much to do with it, but they think I was selected because I was perceived as a studious officer who was sober. So I was assigned to a Vietnamese lieutenant who was to go with me to these target areas. And his name was Bo. B-A-O was a Vietnamese name. First target Bo and I visited was just northwest of Highway 4 in southern Vinh Long Province, north of the Ba Sac River. 4 or 5 miles as the crow flies from Binh Tui, which is where my base was, and perhaps 8 or 9 miles south of Sa Dec. With Bo in the passenger seat of my Jeep, I drove to Can Tho and then took the ferry north across the Ba Sac River to Highway 4. Within a couple miles, we turned onto a side track, and soon we saw plumes of smoke behind some high grass. The bombing reportedly had occurred within an hour or so prior to our arrival. We got out of the Jeep. As I walked cautiously through the high grass toward the smoke, I heard low moans, then increasingly loud roars. I looked to my right and saw a water buffalo, a third of its skull gone, and a 3-foot gash in its belly. I couldn't believe it was still alive. I felt sick. Soon, even more pitiful sights came into view. Out of the corner of my eye, perhaps 80 feet towards center left, I saw one young girl trying to get up on her feet, using a stick as a makeshift cane, but she quickly fell down. A few other people were moving ever so slightly as they cried and moaned on the ground. Most of the human victims I saw were women and children, the vast majority lying motionless. Most, I'm sure, were dead. Napalm had blackened their bodies, making many of them nearly unrecognizable. My first thought was that I was witnessing an egregious, horrendous mistake. The target was no more than a small fishing and rice farming community. The village was smaller than a baseball playing field. The Mekong Delta region is completely flat, and the modest houses in its hamlets are built on small mounds among rice paddies. As with most settlements, this one was undefended. No anti-aircraft guns, no visible small arms, no defenders of any kind. The pilots who bombed this small hamlet flew low-flying A-37Bs and were able to get close to the ground without fear of being shot down, thus increasing the accuracy of their strafing and bombing. They certainly would have been able to see the inhabitants, mostly women with children taking care of various farming and domestic chores. They had the option to abort their mission based on their own observations from the air. They could have been back safe and sound in Binh Tui in less than 15 minutes. Instead, they came back with a big thumbs up. Mission accomplished. Colonel An need not have worried about any of his pilots missing their targets. The buildings were virtually flattened by explosions or destroyed by fire. I didn't see one person that really remained standing. I began sobbing and gagging. I couldn't fathom what I was seeing, smelling, thinking. I took a few faltering steps to my left, only to find my way blocked by the body of a young woman lying at my feet. She had been clutching 3 small, partially blackened children when she apparently collapsed. I bent down for a closer look and stared, aghast, at the woman's open eyes. The children were motionless, blackened blood drying on their bullet and shrapnel-riddled bodies. Napalm had melted much of the woman's face, including her eyelids, but as I focused on her face, it seemed that her eyes were staring at me